solutions for the global housing crisis. And just some quick introductions to the moderators. I will be moderating. I'm Yua Sillier. I'm from the Commonwealth Association of Planners, currently in Sydney, so it's nighttime where I am. And my co-moderator is Bruce Stiftel. Bruce, if you want to wave, it's morning where Bruce are, so it's we cover the whole globe, and we've got a great panel group that we'll introduce in a bit. Just to start us off, I would like to acknowledge that this project is headed by the Planners for Climate Action, and the co-lead on this specific UTC is the Commonwealth Association of Planners. But with all global events like this, it's not a solo attempt. We had a lot of help and partners from across the globe who helped to create and bring this event to life. And so I just want to acknowledge the Royal Town Planning Institute, the Global Planning Education Association Network, American Planning Association, Global Planners Network, University of Technology in Sydney, the Planning Institute of Australia, and the New Zealand Planning Institute. So they all help to create this idea, and we've got panelists from even more different institutions that we will introduce shortly. And we have almost 200 online guests and members joining us tonight or this morning if you're in Bruce's world. So it's really great. It's a global conversation, and we really hope that it is a conversation. We really look forward to all the inputs. Also, a special shout out to RTPI for hosting us today. And we are using a different platform that you might not be familiar with. It's called Beak Marker. So it's a little bit different than the Zoom and the Teams meetings that we are used to, but this is specifically for large global collaboration. So thank you to RTPI. I would at this stage encourage our participants and audience to find the chat button, if you can see the chat on your screen. And maybe at this stage, just pop there, where are you from? Where's your country or the city where you are from, to familiarize yourself with the platform. And then just some further housekeeping rules. As attendees, you have all been muted by the organizer, but we still would very much like for you to join in via the chat box and the Q&A. If you lose your connection to this session, then please just refresh your browser and rejoin via the link. And then same for the speakers, just wait, in the webinar, and we will continue as soon as we can. So it's a global connection. There's a lot of people from different places in the world, and we are trying our best to make this work with technology, crossing fingers that it will all go smooth. In terms of questions, audience, we would like for you to post questions in the Q&A tool. So it's tricky. There's a chat tool and there's a Q&A tool. So please look for the Q&A tool, and then you click on that one and you can post questions that we will then have the panel members address. So you can start right now by posting your questions, and you can also upvote. So if you like a question that somebody else has posted, you can like it, and that will most probably then be answered by the panel members. So audience, welcome for you to continue in the Q&A box as well. For the chat box, we would like to keep that for any comments or technical issues. So just keep that separate. If there's a comment, keep that as chat, and if there's a question you want the panel to consider, put it in the Q&A. And we will also run 2 polls. So you will see that pop up on your screen, and it would be great if everybody can participate in that, but we'll walk you through so you don't have to stress about the polls and at this stage what you have to do. So I would like to give over to Bruce at this stage to introduce the wonderful range of panel members that we have here today. Bruce.
Thank you, Yua. This is Bruce Stiftel in Atlanta, Georgia, in the States. I'm with Planners for Climate Action and the Georgia Institute of Technology. We have an incredible lineup of experienced planners and policymakers to share their ideas with you about housing this morning. I'm going to very quickly introduce them, and then they'll be speaking with you directly in just a few moments. We have John Brockhoff in Sydney, Australia. He's the National Policy Director of the Planning Institute of Australia. We have Jim Ebenha, who is a member of the New Zealand Planning Institute Board of Directors. He's Planning and Policy Manager in Waikato District in New Zealand, and he is formerly with the policy team at Housing New Zealand. Lindsay Richards is president of the Royal Town Planning Institute in the UK. She is a trustee of a design firm and has 30 years of experience in the public sector. Yu Wing, Canadian Institute of Planners, is in Ottawa. She's a senior planner with the National Capital Commission, Commission de la Capitale Nationale, in Canada, and previously was with the city of Ottawa. She's also done work in Vietnam and Sri Lanka. Lena Thomas is in Sydney, Australia. She's a professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, where she teaches sustainable architecture and climate justice. Evis Levin is a senior lecturer with the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia, the Department of Sustainability and Planning, where she teaches housing policy. Paulo Silva is assistant professor at the University of Aveiro in Portugal, and he is chair of the Global Planning Education Association Network. And finally, Jason Jordan in Washington, D.C. in the States is the public affairs director of the American Planning Association, where he has worked for 25 years. He is currently leading the Housing Supply Accelerator Project jointly between the American Planning Association and the National League of Cities. And Jason is our keynote speaker this morning. I'm going to turn things over to him so that he can set the stage for our conversation. Jason, wonderful to have you here today.
Bruce, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for joining us. As Bruce said, I'm in Washington, D.C. With the American Planning Association, and just wanted to take a few moments at the outset to talk a little bit about the broad picture of why housing is perhaps so critical at this particular moment in time. When we have asked at APA planners what their highest priorities are, pretty consistently we get these four answers. They want to tackle climate change. They want to improve economic growth and prosperity. They want to advance social equity, or they're coping with the challenge of various demographic changes. And what we find is that in many respects, housing supply sits at the intersection of any one of those particular issues. If we want to tackle carbon emissions, where we place houses and how we build them is an obvious key driver. If we're looking at wealth generation and economic prospects, a home is critical to people's prospects for jobs. It's the largest source of wealth in many countries. When we think about social equity, of course, housing policy, I should say, has often been a tool of exclusion. So when we talk about inclusive growth, when we talk about giving people new opportunities and access, housing becomes central to how we advance social equity. And certainly in the area of demographic change, as we think about the rise of single-person households and the needs of an aging society, as we think about international migration patterns, all of these things tend to bring us back to this issue of how can we provide housing in the right places at the right price points in order to accomplish the objectives that planners have. And I would posit that in many respects, this has become such an acute political problem in so many countries because, to put it bluntly, so many people feel stuck. Either they're stuck in the homes that they have and they lack the ability to move into new housing types that fit their needs, or they're stuck because of affordability issues. We are seeing in the United States low levels of mobility. People simply aren't moving to where jobs are available. And one of the real drivers of that is the lack of adequate housing supply. We have seen dramatic growth in single-person households, so that the housing stock we have in many places isn't fit for purpose for the kinds of households that are being created, driving pressures on the limited availability of what is provided. And we just saw a report yesterday here that we have a historic high number of households that are debt free. That is, they've paid off their mortgage and own their house free and clear, which sounds like good news at first. But when you look at that a little more carefully, what it really is an indicator of is older people who simply can't move because they lack the options, or the overall economic climate isn't conducive for them to move. And the fact that they're not means that that housing stock isn't available to the next generation of potential renters or homeowners. So housing supply really is critical. I know many of you are familiar with this, and so I don't want to be too simplistic, but I do think it's important to set first principles in order. Why are we in an affordable housing crisis? Typically, when we think about housing, we think about these inputs. There's labor, there's lumber, the cost of materials and construction, there's the price of land, and then there's the impact of law and rules. I would say, when you look at the political environment, and I spend most of my time for the American Planning Association focused on the intersection of policy and planning. So I deal a lot with elected officials, and I can say absolutely conclusively that housing is having a real moment here in the United States. And I dare say, looking at some of the politics in your own countries, that it's having a moment pretty much everywhere, where policymakers are heavily focused on this issue in a way that is highly unusual for an issue like this to really captivate the political imagination. We're in the midst of a presidential election, and during this campaign, we have heard candidates repeatedly on both parties talk about the critical issue of housing supply, housing availability. The interesting thing about this from a planning perspective to me is that this housing moment is actually a planning moment. And here's why it's so important for planners. As a policymaker, when you look at those economic inputs to the cost of housing, you think about labor, issues of workforce development, the skills, the availability of that workforce, and the productivity of that workforce, typically are fairly long-term issues. They're difficult to move as a public policy lever. When you think about the lumber issue, the supply issues, whether it's the cost of raw materials or supply chain issues, again, for most policymakers, those are macroeconomic issues that, to the degree that they can be moved by the individual policy decisions in a given country, they don't move quickly. Land has its own challenges in terms of broader market forces or geography in many places. So it really leaves you with this issue of the law, and the law specifically reflected through things like zoning, land use, building codes, and the various regulatory structures around housing. So if you're a policymaker looking for, I won't call it a quick win, but a quicker win than some of these other areas, you're naturally going to gravitate, I think, toward these issues that are firmly connected and firmly rooted in both the policymaker mind and the public mind with the practice of planning. So we are really in the center of this conversation, whether we want to be or not. And it gives us both tremendous challenges because we're being looked to, and in some cases blamed, if I'm honest, for the challenges that we confront. But it's also an enormous moment of opportunity, which sort of gives us the impetus for really creating action. Bruce alluded to something called the Housing Supply Accelerator that I'm leading here at the American Planning Association. And really driving the whole idea of the Housing Supply Accelerator is this issue of housing supply. Now, certainly demand side policies, subsidies to support folks, we recognize that income is always a major factor in housing and housing affordability. So demand side policies are something we have a long history of supporting and think are important. But we also realize that pouring resources onto the demand side in a supply constrained environment is partially a factor driving housing costs and inflationary pressures. So we're trying to focus on supply side solutions while still recognizing the demand side of the ledger. But we have very specifically tried to define supply as housing that is diverse, meaning diverse housing types and diverse housing options for people, housing that's attainable, so affordable to people at all price points. So this is not exclusively, in our minds, a capital A, if you will, affordable housing issue, although that's part of it. But it really requires policy and planning interventions across price points so that the housing is attainable. Here, we have a particular challenge with workforce housing as sort of a big hole in our housing policy. Thirdly, that housing needs to be equitable, and our policy interventions need to focus on and reckon with the history of exclusionary housing policies across our country. And then lastly, and this is particularly appropriate given the intersection of climate and housing, it needs to be sustainable. So we need to think about solutions that contemplate the spatial dimensions of the problem as well as some of the material dimensions of the problem. And really, this is leading us toward this notion of an abundance agenda. And it's a bit of a philosophical shift in planning from thinking about issues of scarcity to thinking about planning for issues of abundance and issues of growth. And while certainly planning for growth is always part of a comprehensive approach, I think sometimes in the housing space we have tended to constrain our approach, particularly in our regulatory systems, which is where I will spend just a little bit of time. We have created through our partnership at the Housing Supply Accelerator a resource called the Housing Supply Accelerator Playbook. There's a QR code there on your screen. I encourage you to take a look at it. It's available on the APA website at planning.org as well. It's intended to be a collection of promising practices in different sectors, which I'll get to in just a second. But the idea really driving the playbook and the partnership overall is this idea of looking at the housing challenge, the housing crisis, if you will, as a systems problem, and planning being the critical system at the center of this. So we take a look at the system, and then we try to take a multi-sectoral approach to identify potential solutions, recognizing that not every solution is appropriate to every place. Every country has its own unique regulatory environment, legal framework, but nevertheless, to lift up some common solutions that are available. And when I talk about multi-sectoral, Bruce alluded to the fact that this partnership is driven by planners and local elected officials. The National League of Cities is our partner here. They represent mayors and local elected officials of all stripes. So it's the political side of the local leadership coming together with the planning side. But we recognize that when we talk about housing as a system, we have to think about the entire pipeline of supply. So we invited a range of different partners to come to the table to join us, to represent the construction and development perspective, the finance industry, and of course, planners representing the land use and the regulatory environment. So we have our National Association of Home Builders, the National Association of Realtors, and the Mortgage Bankers Association coming together with mayors and planners in a collaboration and partnership to try to drive these solutions. And I think it's been important for us to identify those partnerships that are a little bit unusual. So it's not just fellow design professionals coming together to talk about this problem, but the perspective of folks who are lending the money to build the homes, the developers themselves, and the folks in the middle who are, making the real estate transactions happen. And those perspectives are a little bit different than what we have traditionally heard. And it's been fascinating the degree to which they really don't seem to understand each other very well. And so one of the things that planning is extremely well suited to do is to be that convener and to put the different perspectives together to try to move toward a consensus. And frankly, in our political situation, these groups often do not agree on public policy intervention. So this has been a challenging conversation, but a really important one where having the perspective of the folks trying to get the financing to do the construction, along with the lenders themselves, with the planners who are trying to think, about the land use and the very specific geographical constraints of the development process, has been really, I think, helpful in identifying pain points in that housing system where relatively small but creative measures can make a big difference. When you look at the playbook overall, you will see a series of strategies that are focused on all of these categories. But I wanted, since we're planners, wanted to take a moment to focus specifically on some of the planning issues. And again, you will see this theme of system reform come to the fore here. Thinking about starting with a planning process, starting with the idea of really inventorying and understanding your situation and your housing goals, and then aligning the process of your regulatory structures to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. I think very often there's a sort of paradox that we confront in planning, where we plan for what we want, but we create a regulatory system for what we don't. And how can we create a regulatory system that is fundamentally focused on delivering what we say we want through the planning process, and moving the legitimate public engagement conversations and the debate about how much housing do we want, for whom, and where into the planning process, or at least closer to the planning process, and further from a politicized project by project, variance driven approach, which typically slows everything down. And how can we shift our thinking about permitting and review processes to speed those things up? So ultimately, I think about this from the perspective of kind of 4 S's. We want to create a systems approach. We want to simplify the overall system. There's too much regulatory complexity in too many ways in many communities. We want to speed the process to be as efficient as possible. And then we want to work with policymakers to support the production that we need, because we recognize that all of these reforms, all of these changes to the regulatory system only lay the foundation. Once the foundation is laid, that allows us to build what we want, but we still need various financial and other interventions to begin to support that actual development so that we get produced what it is that we've planned for. So let me just conclude these opening remarks with kind of a broad overview of what we have learned through this 1.5 year long partnership. One, we've learned that the partnership itself is vital. It's vital for the political credibility with state, local, and federal policymakers, but it isn't easy. We don't often agree, and so there has to be a process of joint understanding and compromise. And that's really been driven by conversations, and they're incredibly helpful, even if they're hard and contentious. And I have to say, they have been hard and contentious at times, I think in part because of the acute nature of the overall problem that we're trying to solve. But we have to embrace that and look for creative solutions on all sides. And I will say, for planners here in the United States, this has been an awkward process where we have had to go through a moment of some reckoning, I would say, to come to the place where we can not simply defend the status quo because we have been responsible for developing it. Right? It's easy to become defensive of a system that to be in need of repair and modernization. And so we have really leaned into the idea of reform. And I think that's one of the other lessons learned here, is that until we embrace reform, it's difficult to be at the table with policymakers to drive that sort of change. But in all of this is the real opportunity for planners to be thought leaders, to step out and be seen as the experts in providing that technical support for policymakers as they move through this process. And then lastly, I'm so encouraged by this conversation, because one of the things we've learned is the power of sharing solutions. And that's what today's program is all about. And I look forward to the opportunity to share solutions with you and to hear what's happening with your efforts all around the world. So thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to be part of this, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Jason. That is a very, very good kickoff to this very complex topic. And as you said, it's about sharing solutions, or hopefully co-creating solutions, right? That can be at least adapted to any possible context. Just a reminder to our audience, I've not been seeing any questions coming in. So maybe in a reflection on Jason's presentation, is it relevant to your context? Do you think similar things is happening in your country or in your city? Post the questions. Let's hear your voices, get the audience part of the conversation. But at this stage, I would very much like to put our panel members on the spot with a very short 2 to 3 minute response by sharing a brief example of a successful housing initiative from their country or their organization, drawing on either sustainability or affordability, anything solution-wise positive, bringing to this conversation. So we're going to keep it short and brief and have a continuing conversation later on. But first up, let's hear from John. What solution do you think, or what positive example can you bring?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Before I go into positive examples, I want to have a go at framing the discussion around housing crises, and it obviously is portrayed in different ways in different jurisdictions. In Australia, it very quickly gets reduced into a housing supply solution, with no one inquiring as to exactly what is that a solution to? What is the questions that we are trying to resolve? What are the range of housing crises that we have? Is it the difficulty of entering home ownership, which certainly has got a lot harder in the last 2 decades? Is it a lack of affordable rental? And especially as the private market is being squeezed at both ends, with fewer and fewer top-end renters entering the ownership market and causing a logjam at that end. And at the bottom end, fewer and fewer private renters who would have found themselves in social housing or affordable housing moving in, being or having that available. So you're really getting the private rental market squeezed at both ends in Australia and causing housing stress. And then beneath the ownership and rental issues, there's also a crisis around livability, where people's choices are limited to unsuitable housing that might not be the right fit for a changing climate. So I think we need to ask the right question before we come up with the right solution. And in not every case is more private market supply the be all and end all. Certainly we need to reform our planning systems along the line Jason was talking, but we also need to understand what problem is we're trying to solve. And in Australia, watching access to housing become further and further out of reach has been like watching a slow motion train wreck. We could see it coming over the last 2 decades with each new tax advantage since the year 2000 that's made investing in housing relatively more profitable to other investments. Our residential housing market assets now top $11 trillion, and those with housing equity in Australia are enjoying phenomenal gains and consuming more and bigger housing, while the growing number of people who are outside the private market are becoming relatively poorer. So while boosting housing stock is important to meet household needs, it's unrealistic to, I guess, percolate all of our housing crisis into a single issue with a single private market housing supply solution. And then it's even more inappropriate to say, well, to address the private market housing supply solution, we should rely only on very ad hoc rezoning, bearing in mind the critical role that land use planning makes together with infrastructure planning to enable the orderly, effective and sustainable development of future land and future typologies of housing. So, we do know what planning can do that's positive, and Jason's talked us through some of that, but we also have got to expect that there are other factors at play. Private property interests will only introduce new stock onto the market at the rate at which that stock will be absorbed profitably. We do have supply constraints and logistical barriers. And look, I thought I'd put up in the QR code there a really interesting paper that was prepared for New South Wales Parliament on some of these issues around the price elasticity of supply, because it's not a topic I've seen well researched internationally. So I draw that to your attention. And I think planning does have a critical role around enabling orderly development, and where we do our planning well and address some of the issues Jason talked about, planning can be a lane marker and not a roadblock or a barrier to the speed at which new supply can come online. I think it's really important that if we don't simply talk about planning as look at some of the advantages planning, orderly land use planning, orderly sequencing of development, integrated infrastructure and land use planning. Look at the efficiencies that can deliver, improve our planning systems to respond more rapidly, but also acknowledge that there are many demand side issues that come into play. So I'll be later on talking about a particular case study at Green Square in Sydney that talks about how long-term planning can deliver results in the community interest and not result in a giveaway of windfall gains to speculation, and can actually deliver an inclusive and sustainable community while producing at a rapid rate substantial supply, not just at the top end, but for across the entire housing spectrum. So I might leave it there for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So from Australia to the UK, Lindsay, what's your views on it?
Thank you. I'm just getting through to the slides. But, here we go. So I just thank you, and it's great to be part of the conversation and contribute in the UK perspective. Across the UK, we've got an ageing housing stock and a need to retrofit in order to meet and achieve our net zero targets. And actually, in the UK, we have 29 million homes, which account for 14% of the country's total carbon emissions. And we have 75% of our local authorities who've actually declared a climate emergency since November 21. So I just want to do a quick context and a quick introduction to a small site. And actually, this signifies the importance of the contribution of small sites and SMEs in delivering housing. And Jason referred to small and creative measures that are making a difference. So that's what I'm going to focus on in the next minute or two. So Gedling Green is a small site. It's delivering just 33 homes, but that's part of a larger site which will deliver around 1,000 homes or so in the future. It's in the Midlands, where land values are lower than the south and the southeast in the country, but there is still a high demand for housing. This site is a brownfield site, and it's a former colliery site. So the significance of the site is that actually across the 33 homes, it's going to meet the full Future Homes standard. And this is actually ahead of its introduction next year in 2025. The Future Homes standard is aiming to eliminate dwellings' reliance on fossil fuels and instead using low carbon energy sources such as heat pumps and other renewables. Now, the 33 homes we see here in Gedling Green, they will feature air source heat pumps, solar PVs, increased levels of insulation, and then EV charging points. But as Jason was talking about the importance of partnership, and partnerships really matter, there are a number of crucial partners in this scheme. One is a willing landowner, so to take leadership in advancing increased standards for future homes, and also a very proactive and championing local authority wanting to meet net zero targets within their area. And then alongside that is one of our universities, University of Birmingham, and they're using this site for research, that being vital to enable evidence-based decision making as UK transitions to low carbon homes. And the university will also monitor and review the construction, the commissioning, handover, and 2 years of post-occupancy with interviews and also the use of sensors in those properties. So, and there again, this will support the wider rollout of technology. I think two other crucial partners, government agency, so Homes England, who's the delivery arm of the Housing Ministry, and their involvement gives confidence to the sector and also the ability to roll out best practice and actually say, this is achievable and this is how it can be done. And then finally, but really important, again, Jason has mentioned financial sector, but banking groups supporting loans and also mortgage availability. And this is key in supporting the project through green mortgage products, helping to make buying an efficient, energy efficient home actually more affordable and more accessible. So that's really quick. To finish, this is a pilot study which will inform our future housing standards and tackling climate emergency. So it's important ensuring those houses are affordable, and that actually the right financial support can be in place. So it's a small site, but actually it's got a big impact for us across the UK. So that's
sounds great,
our
Lindsay.
project.
And I do hear a lot of the multidisciplinary stakeholders that Jason also referred to. So it's good to be seeing themes coming through. Let me throw to Paulo. What's your view on good case studies or good examples?
Hi. Good evening, good morning, everyone. I'm based here in Portugal, chairing by now GPAN, and my approach to the topic is the one that is following a bit what John already said about what are the questions. I mean, what are the questions that are behind this housing scarcity that is very recent? I mean, if we think that 20 years ago we've been maybe discussing gentrification. These days, we are not talking about gentrification anymore. It seems almost ridiculous compared with the other problems that, in the meantime, globally we facing. So I want to keep this global perspective from my role here, but on the other hand, I have to get an example that is local. And mentioning the impact of other dynamics on housing markets, we have to talk about financialization of the cities. So housing is not anymore just a good or an asset for people to use, but it's also a financial asset. It can be even empty, it's still a financial asset. So it's not anymore complying its basic and main function, but it's responding to other interests. And on the other hand, touristification. These are two, usually I say to my students when I want to explain them what touristification is doing to cities, I'm comparing it with industrialization. When this happened in the 19th century, every corner would fit for workers' housing and would be a place where to build a small factory. Now it's happening the same with the tourism industry. So going back to my good example, small solutions or small initiatives are being the response in many contexts. I'm referring here the context of Spain, where I recently was in an internship in Malaga, where really resistance movement has been able to stop this invasion of touristification and financialization of the city of Malaga. Still with small impacts, but Lagunillas, where this picture was taken, is a good example where people are taking in their hands their fate and trying to fight and try to resist to the main trends in the housing market. So I would stop by here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Insightful. Let's go to New Zealand. Jim, what's your views? You're still on mute. We had to say it once, right?
I see. Thank you. I was just going to apologize for my Ohio twang. That may have been why I was muted. I've been in New Zealand for 23 years. I'm talking to you here from Hamilton, New Zealand, which is our 4th largest city. But yeah, sort of at the micro scale here, and I know New Zealand itself is micro, but one building, which is not based on a detailed case study, but on a thought process and observation I had last week when I was in Auckland for a local government conference. There in Aotea Square, which is the civic square in downtown Auckland, I saw the former Auckland City Council office tower, formerly known as the Civic Administration Building. It's now a a housing development. And the first thing I saw, aside from the building itself there, of course, was the sign that says one of Auckland's truly sustainable developments. Talks about reuse of the steel frame. 98% of the demolition waste going into road construction rather than landfill. And I thought, that's awesome. What a great thing to have showcased in the center of New Zealand's biggest city. Then I looked at the sign to the right, which there's a small version of it there. You can't really read very well, but I went, uh-oh, because it said one of New Zealand's premier luxury developments. I went, oh, great for the people who can afford it. So then I went online later in that day, and I found that the prices actually, while it may be luxury, and the prices are actually in line with the rest of Auckland, which are the prices are absurd by global standards in some sense. But the average house price in in Auckland at the moment is around $1 million. Here are some one-bedroom units for about 600,000, up to $1 million for the 3-bedroom ones. It is a lot of money, but in the Auckland context, not bad. And then I talked to some folks from Auckland, and they said that is a great location. It's 30 seconds away from a new rail station, the City Rail Link, which will take people from downtown Auckland to connect more directly to the suburban rail network. I thought, well, so from an affordability perspective, again, you ditch that extra car that costs $36,000 a year. Again, not at the super affordable end of the spectrum by any means, but the thought process had taken me through from sustainability to, I suppose, quality, luxury quality, but also that affordability dimension. And there are other examples through Hyperlink, which will be in the handouts, through the New Zealand Green Building Council, that have examples of more affordable housing through community trusts, prefabricated housing, et cetera. But this one to me was striking, and it was sort of fresh on my mind. So that's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Jim. Really good example. I know we're going at a fast pace, but this is all for quick introductions and as a icebreaker to the conversation. So Iris, maybe over to you.
Thank you, Yura, and hi everyone. I'll try to be quick. I don't see my slide there, but I'm very happy that John started and talked about not there. Yeah, about the context in Australia, because I think everybody else, I think what you kind of set in the scene is really important. I still can't see my slide, but it doesn't matter. What I want to say, that one of the issues that maybe John mentioned, but not really went into it, is the very low rate of social housing in Australia. Only around 4% across Australia. In Victoria, where I am, Melbourne, it's even less than 3%. Whereas, as you probably most of you know, in the Netherlands, it's about 30%, and England 17%. So I think this is a huge issue that perhaps Australia needs to do something about. I also, in my slide, I had some photos of a social mixed development in Carlton, Melbourne, where doesn't matter, where a recently completed project that tried to create a mixed tenure community, as now things, this is very common in many cities around the world, and Melbourne is very, very going in that direction, trying to bring in private money to fund public housing or social housing, community housing. The way this has been done in Carlton is highly problematic, and I showed there in the image an internal garden that was accessible only to private residents and not to public resident tenants. So this is not a good sustainable community, but maybe I'll talk later and mention other more successful development that we can learn from. Thank you.
That sounds good. We will definitely take you up on that, Iris, to hear more about those initiatives. Lena, over to you.
Thank you, Yua. So the slide that you've been looking at is an example of a housing project that was developed on a former golf course in Western Sydney, in Sydney, Australia. And it's an area in Sydney that faces some of the most extreme temperatures and rates of high development and growth, and it's a development for about 850 homes with a private, a developer. But the reason I want to just talk about this is about some of the kind of lessons about things that can be done at scale, which can think about houses being both considered from an affordable and a sustainable point of view, which were key drivers. And listening to Lindsay's presentation earlier, this is a project that has already been completed, and we were UTS led a living laboratory over 3 years with monitored data looking at the performance of these homes and the strategies that were put at scale, because this was a precinct level development. And I just want to highlight a couple of the wins that were possible. The development incorporated geothermal air conditioning through ground source heat pumps for heating and cooling. And that reduced the greenhouse emissions and created a 21% saving on the electricity bills, something that has skyrocketed compared to homes in the area of sort of similar age. But then when you think of it from an affordability perspective, the developers, the design focused on compact homes. Australia otherwise leads the US on some of our house sizes. And here we were thinking about compact homes looking at compact homes on compact lots in a medium density configuration. And when we take that into account, households were saving 38% on their electricity bill in comparison. But then what else would you see in that image in the site of a former golf course, open parklands, walking tracks, I could go on. All of that was yielding the social dividend of the connectivity to open space, parklands, high ratings for satisfaction, comfort, health and well-being for the residents, which became very important during those critical months of our COVID lockdown as well. And so the point I want to make here is also about what was viable, because it was thought of right from the planning process, right down to the point of implementation, and because it was done at scale. And yes, it was a built for market one, which they did command a premium. But I think I'm sort of saying, regardless, as we start thinking about affordable housing, and in many of our contexts, we're thinking about increasing density, it's important that we don't think about supply in isolation. It has to be density that is done well. And we do have an opportunity that we cannot afford to ignore. And that is, to think about occupant or public health aspects and planetary health aspects in tandem. I'll just leave it here with this lingering, so you can download much more in our summary report for the Living Laboratory, which has key insights for different stakeholders. Thank you, Yua.
Thank you, Lena. That's some great and very insightful information to keep in mind. And last but definitely not least, let's go all the way to Canada. So Hugh.
Hi there. I'm not sure if my image is there, but I will say it's the one with the 2 red towers. I'm not sure who has control, but I'll start with it. I want to give an example in Ottawa, Canada, but maybe I'll start first that the National Capital Commission, which I'll just refer to as the NCC, it's a federal crown agency and it owns approximately 11% of land within the National Capital Region. I've been working on the redevelopment of Le Breton Flats, which is a 29-hectare site in downtown Ottawa. We recently completed the master concept plan, and we have a specific policy that requires that at least 25% of the housing is affordable housing, and we're currently in the implementation phase. So the case study I wanted to discuss is our first phase, which we refer to as the library parcel, and that's because it's being built next to the new central library, a catalyst in Le Breton Flats. It's 1.1 hectares in size. It's next to a light rail station, so it's a really great site for a high density development. The NCC, we partnered with the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and the site went to market under the Federal Lands Initiative program, which is a federal program, or it's a program that sells federal lands to support affordable housing. So the price was set in advance for this site. It was valued at $30 million, and it was competed out for the highest number of affordable units that could be provided. So in this case, at least 30% of 600 units was required to be affordable. We do have this new master concept plan, so we want to ensure that the principles, the guiding vision was being implemented with this development. And so these requirements were part of the request for proposals to ensure sustainability, community benefits, and high quality design as part of the evaluation criteria. So in this case, in the RFP, it was about the quality of the proposal and not about the highest bid price. So there was no financial scoring. The successful proposal was by Dream Le Breton. I'll show this the image in a moment, but it's a partnership between a developer known as Dream and a multi-faith housing initiative, which is a not-for-profit housing partner. It's a mixed-use development that's going to deliver 608 housing units, which 41% will be affordable and deeply affordable units. So this project is This project is currently under construction and it's expecting its first residents in 2026. I will put the NCC Le Breton website in the chat, and so you can look for more information. But it's a project that I think we're really excited to see develop over the next few years. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh. That is very exciting, and we look forward to hear and know more about the specific project. At this stage, Bruce, I'm going to hand over to you that you dive deeper into this context-specific approaches and what's happening in all the countries. So over to you.
Thank you, Ewa. So we've heard a little bit from each of the speakers about projects they've been associated with and what's going on in their countries. We want to take a little more time to give them a moment to expand and to share some of the more important details, but also give a flavor for the national impact and context. We're going to start with the practitioners and hear from them, and then we'll move to the educators on the panel. And I want to start with John in Australia, who talked a little bit about Green Square. And John, I don't know if you want to say more about Green Square or if you want to talk more generally about the innovative strategies that are going on in Australia.
Thank you. I will talk more about Green Square because it does strike at the heart of what planning can do around shaping a great place, if and when it's done well. And I'm really proud to have had some, I guess, in involvement in Green Square over the entirety of my career. It's been still going. It's been at least a 20-year project. From the metropolitan strategy, the extension of Sydney's global economic arc beyond just the Sydney CBD to a notion of expanding that economic activity towards Sydney's airport, a 300-hectare site with a lot of promise, opportunities for lining up integrated infrastructure planning at that very city-wide scale with the location of a new rail line servicing the airport with a new station that anchored one end of a major new brownfield renewal area. And the great thing about Green Square is not just some of the wonderful outcomes in terms of housing mix, in terms of environment and inclusivity. It's that a vision was able to be sustained through orderly, well-integrated planning work against a clear long-term vision. In fact, a vision that's been sustained over 6 local government elections, with that same vision being sustained politically throughout. And I think having that consistency of planning vision, having the resilience in the governance arrangements to sustain the planning approach, and I'll go into that briefly, has been one of the great wins of a great example of doing density well, and doing that in a way that has improved the return on investment for major capital investment in public infrastructure. It's also involved significant investment from private partners who have also benefited from public de-risking of the site to help create a market for the wider variety of housing types that are there. And it's really special. I'll just flick through to the next slide. In that it was a deliberate process of having the public infrastructure first, and having the public infrastructure lead the project. And in this case, the water infrastructure, the public boulevard that extended from the rail station through the site, was not just a visual feature, but it was part of the water engineering, the water sensitive urban design, and the design with nature for the development. And in this green sway, there's also many of the community facilities, including an impressive library, impressive walking and cycling trails, and a whole range of recreational facilities that created the presence to attract the high value investment that drove aspects of the real estate market. But I think having a sequenced local infrastructure plan rolled out with each precinct, and having as a central feature the urban stormwater recycling systems, the tree-lined boulevard, low-speed streets, the extra wide footpaths, the separated cycleways, and smart street furniture really set the scene. And having that done early really set the scene for the entire development. And it was entirely consistent with the long-term social and environmental targets that the City of Sydney and the state government had set through long-term strategies for the area. Another really interesting thing in terms of the inclusivity, sorry, I think something's gone a bit mad there. I'll take it back to, if someone's, sorry there. I'm not sure what's happening with the slides, but in any case, what I am trying to settle on here is a slide that shows that the social housing outcomes in amongst, there was a seamless mix of private and public housing. One of the previous speakers talked about the social housing residents not having access to private open space. The design strategy at Green Square was for the social housing to be indistinguishable from the private offering. And I think that inclusivity is really a great cultural feature of the Green Square's development. And it was really important that through the development opportunities created by, I guess, the public de-risking of the site, that there was possible for a portion of the land value uplift to be captured by both the public and private partners and recycled into the local infrastructure, which in turn cycled that value through the entire precinct. And there was a fundamental aim of delivering 15% of the residential floor space as social and affordable housing, and that it couldn't be told apart. Look, zoning and development control plans were vital to establish the certainty of what was expected, the design standards, the environmental performance, and the development forms to offer the amenity, and particularly a stress on a wider range of housing types, especially more studio and family 3-bedroom plus apartments. In Australia and in Sydney in particular, the private investment market for housing, if it's not greenfield single detached housing, it's very much two-bedroom units. And with the household dynamics that we all have, the changing household dynamics, it becomes a little bit more problematic than it should be to attract particularly private developers to deliver something that's outside the box, and even family units are a push. So it was important that the public land development dimension of this project kept construction moving, introduced the market to greater diversity, helped move construction through construction cycles over the last 2 decades, and kept the whole show going. And in particular, it unlocked some of the keystone sites in the town centre, and essentially changed the, I guess, the culture and the amenity and the attractiveness for the private partners to do what they did so well and deliver design quality that Sydney hadn't seen in this type of brownfield setting.
Thank you, John.
It's not. Yeah, I'll just wrap up there and just point out that this is not a something that's unique to Australia. It's just that what is unique is the sustained political will, the sustained vision, the holding all of the partners to a series of KPIs that relate to sustainability and social inclusion, and then having a decision-making framework that delivered over the long term. And I think that's the innovation, and that is a great example of density done well and sustained good planning over a long period of time and across political cycles. And so planning is so much more than just rezoning everything everywhere all at once. It's bringing to bear these skills. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Much appreciated, John. Jim, I want to acknowledge you've drawn the short straw on time of day. I think it's very late.
Yeah, 4 minutes past midnight.
Well, we appreciate your staying up and bright-eyed at this hour for us. Can you give us a little more detailed sense of how New Zealand is bringing sustainability into the calculus to address the housing crisis?
Yeah, sure can. Thank you. Look, New Zealand has a national building code, which provides an opportunity to get some consistency across the country for new builds. And that's particularly important because with migration in particular, New Zealand's population has increased quite a bit over the past few decades. I think it's gone from around 4 million to close to 6 million. So we are seeing any improvement that goes into the national building code, that has a lot of potential to change the housing stock. Unfortunately, some of the focus that we've tried to put in around sustainability, things that you would expect to see in the building code around energy efficiency, for example, it's been stalled by crises like the weather tightness scandal, the leaky home scandal that we had here in New Zealand. So all of a sudden, all the focus was on making sure the buildings were weather tight, which you'd like to take as a given, but no. And then, of course, the Christchurch earthquakes about 10 years ago, 2011, 2012. So focus on structural stability there. So sustainability kind of has at times had to step to the background. And also, unfortunately, houses have kept getting bigger, both in terms of footprint and number of bedrooms. So despite any sort of per square meter sustainability or increased energy efficiency, the overall carbon footprint of new builds in New Zealand is far beyond what its carbon budget should be, estimated at 7 to 10 times, in fact, what it should be to sort of do its part around global warming. So what the government's focus on right now is housing supply. We've had a change of government last year. They're focused on numbers. To a degree, they're also focused on choice. So we're seeing things like requirements for medium density housing to just be allowed in and around town centers and, in fact, residential areas generally. We're seeing accessory dwelling units being just required to be permitted. So removing some local choice around that, but removing local government choice, but promoting wider choice. Again, sustainability not really being legislated for at the moment by the current government, a perception that would add costs. Local government has more flexibility, but also has some constraints. It can't require more than the National Building Code. So local government, where I work, focuses on education. There are positions like eco-design advisors that give people advice around sustainable building measures. There are some incentives where you can get maybe slightly higher footprint or density if you incorporate sustainability measures, but those are kind of few and far between. And in some cases, there's requirements for new builds to tap into gray water and rainwater use. But that, again, has to be tied to a very specific environmental issue. And energy efficiency is not an environmental issue deemed to be that local government can cover through planning legislation. So that's a bit tricky. So I'll just mention, though, the voluntary and the industry sector has a huge role. The New Zealand Green Building Council is very strong. There's some great case studies in the link, and rating programs like Green Star, Home Star, Neighbours, which ties into Australian schemes, et cetera. And finally, I'll just say, being a coastal country, New Zealand obviously has issues around adaptation to climate-related risk, coastal erosion in particular, though flooding and all those associated issues. So I think one of the issues we are really grappling with is how we ensure equity around any managed retreat, how we ensure that we don't put people in harm's way for new development, obviously as a starting point, but then also how we manage any transition to ensure that, any withdrawal from hazard-prone areas is equitable and, sustainable, and maybe reuses materials, buildings, et cetera, relocatable buildings where possible. And so, we're kind of grappling with everything all at once with a small base of planners relatively in New Zealand.
Thank you. Lindsay, you gave us an introduction to Gedling Green and the role of partnerships, and we're hoping you can drill down a little bit into the way that the UK is addressing the housing crisis, protecting environmental sustainability.
Yeah, no, thank you, Bruce. And I think I want to take it up a level in terms of the current context and where we are in the UK, because we've got a new government, more recent than New Zealand, after 14 years. And there is a new ambition for growth and housing delivery. There's an ambition for the delivery of 1.5 million new homes over the next 5 years. So that's not insignificant. And there is a recognition that house building is a key economic driver for growth. And actually in that, planners have been really well positioned currently as to contributing to that growth. We've had a lot of issues around and challenges around planning reforms with the previous government. The current government are looking again at planning reform, and also I think really significantly for the contribution of housing and housing numbers is the reinstatement of mandatory housing targets. There's previously been much resistance to that at the moment, and in fact a lot of local authorities are seeing their housing numbers actually going up significantly. There have been delays because of the planning reforms to our local plans. There have been a number of local plans which have been delayed. That means then a lot of our local authorities and a lot of the housing sites have been subject to challenge, legal challenge, and also planning appeals. There's a current debate at the moment, which is around the Green Belt. And the Green Belt in the UK was actually introduced as an urban containment policy, and it's designed to prevent urban sprawl. I have to say, that policy or the land use designation is actually, it's quite a sensitive and emotive subject at the moment, and it's complex. The government, the new government, have introduced a sequential approach, or looking at a sequential approach for brownfield first and allocated sites, and then they've introduced a new allocation, or looking to, which is grey belt, and again that's more like brownfield sites within the green belt. I think also the new government are also looking at introducing new towns and urban extensions. So at the moment they're looking at the sites for those, but there is a focus on that about working with local communities and local leaders. And I think in the past, it's fair to say there's been quite a lot of significance of resistance from local communities. And I think part of that, the current government is now building what we call a planning super squad to help local authorities deliver those large-scale developments. And there is, with the new government, there's also a renewed focus, I would say, on affordable housing and different tenures. For the environmental standards, I've mentioned net zero, which was introduced in April 21. Those targets are to be met by 2050. And I also mentioned retrofit, so I won't mention that. But what I do want to mention is biodiversity net gain, which has become mandatory in England this year. And that's focused on harnessing the planning system to make sure that biodiversity is left in a better state after a project has been built out. And that's around adding 10% of biodiversity. So our TPI here, we are engaging the new government. It feels like an exciting time for us to be a planner and to be part of and recognised as part of that economic growth and delivery of housing at scale. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you, Lindsay. We'd like you to tell us a bit more about the way in which Canada is pushing to address diversity needs and affordability. The case that you cited earlier had affordability as a priority. We're hoping you can tell us more about that in the national context.
Sure. Thanks, Bruce. And I guess I want to say that the things that I'm hearing from the other panelists really brings home to similar issues that we have in Canada. So I guess I'll bring it up to the macro level in terms of what's happening in Canada by the government of Canada. Similarly to John in New Zealand, there really is a focus on supply and demand. The first initiative that's been recently rolled out is called Public Lands for Home Plan that I wanted to raise. So it's really about leveraging federal public lands. As I mentioned before, the NCC owns 11% of land within the National Capital Region. And similarly to what Lindsay mentioned, we are also the stewards of the green belt around Ottawa and the pressures for development. But I'll get back to the land bank. And this was recently launched last month. So it's very fresh. It's an online inventory of properties across the country that are designated for housing development. These are federal surplus lands and underutilized sites, and they also include NCC sites. Within the inventory, there's standard information such as location, size, site conditions, development permissions, and how to submit your interest or a proposal as a developer. We'll see where it goes. I'm optimistic. We're still early in the process, but really the direction of this program is to make federal lands available under a long-term lease so that the housing stays affordable and the lands stay public. Another initiative that was recently launched by the federal government is looking at ways to streamline the development process. So an example of this is developing a housing design catalog. This will provide standardized housing designs that will reduce times for designs, approvals, and construction. This is actually a copied idea from post-World War II, where there was a similar catalog that was developed to build housing quickly for returning war veterans. The call for proposals closed earlier this year. It sought qualified design firms to develop standardized designs for accessory uses, row houses, fourplexes, sixplexes. It's intended to include designs that are suitable for different lot sizes and regions across the countries. It will prioritize buildability, climate compatibility, and accessibility ready features. The catalog will also look to explore to support higher density construction, such as mid-rise buildings, and looking at different construction methods, such as modular and prefabricated housing. So the next step in the catalog will be released later this year. And the last initiative that I wanted to discuss is really about the federal government trying to incentivize municipalities to increase density through as of right zoning. And if they do that, they would have access to more housing funding. So for example, a property that's only allowed one unit previously, but now has the right to develop a secondary unit or to replace their single detached house with 4 units, this could potentially double or quadruple the number of permitted uses on a lot. So this would also streamline the development process, as a property owner would not need to go through a zoning bylaw amendment. I can only really speak to the city of Ottawa experience, but I would say they were already moving in this direction in terms of increasing density rights. But with access to the federal government's housing fund, it's happening much faster now. So I'll leave it there. Just a few examples of new initiatives happening in Canada that are underway. And similarly, from a federal government perspective, where we have a minority government, we could have an election anytime in the next year. So I think there are some questions about what will happen with these programs as time advances. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I'm struck from these comments about the way in which planning is responsible to take a given policy area and integrate it with the full range of policy issues that are on the ground in a given location. That's been one of planning's strengths forever, and it's certainly an important issue in how we deal with housing today. We're going to turn to the education sector, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks, Bruce. Yes, so just changing a bit to the educational perspective, I would like to ask our educational panel members on our team, how can we better prepare our future planners to address these, the housing crisis and maybe even the associated environmental challenges? So I know it's a big question, but Lena, what's your views on this? How can we do this better?
Okay, thanks, Yura. Earlier when I showed that first project, it was quite clear that there we have something that can become successful when it is a collaboration of planners, urban designers, architects, landscape designers, sustainability consultants, and so on, right from the start. So often we say, oh yes, we've got to teach everybody to work with one another. But I think it starts with actually strengthening the disciplinary expertise of each of our disciplines and getting the real grounding in that. So, I come from an architecture background, but I know that as we're talking here today, in terms of the regulatory, in terms of all of those aspects, that's really, really important grounding, right? But then what we have to do is in our education, expand that mode of thinking in those transdisciplinary contexts. And we're working with young people often in our universities. And going with the UTS experience, I can say that at the moment with our School of Architecture that sort of looks at sort of urban design stuff and links with the School of Built Environment where you are, we have priorities that the students have kind of said that what we have to look at is decarbonization, decolonization, and urban equity, with an emphasis on housing affordability, because it is them that actually have the biggest problems in terms of housing affordability, living in a city like Sydney. So in that sort of context, I think some of the ideas that they are able to sort of think about in terms of housing diversity and to think of different kinds of models as opposed to our stock standard market ready kind of ways, and allowing for that kind of experimentation and thinking about sort of housing futures and sustainable futures. So on the other hand, I suppose the other aspect I'd just like to highlight is, increasing carbon literacy and awareness amongst all our disciplines across the areas that cross, not just at the point of planning or not just at the point of building, but that other aspect, I think, becomes really, really critical. And that becomes important, I think, especially when we think of sort of the other idea of sort of climate justice, which I'm kind of very passionate about, and thinking about vulnerable populations and things like that. So I think what I'm saying is everything we've done, but in a way that actually understands that in this looking ahead, housing is not just, as many of you have spoken around it being just a supply issue. how do we do it well? How do we do the quality?
Yeah.
It means those wider skills and thinking across a range of other disciplines as well, public health, for example.
That's really interesting to hear, Lena, especially from your view as an architect coming into the how do we plan for housing. So very, very interesting to hear that. Iris, what's your take on this?
Yeah,
from an
thank you.
educational perspective?
Yeah, I think Bruce earlier on, when he introduced me, said that I'm teaching now housing policy, and I do teach housing policy for planning students who are doing their masters in planning, urban and regional planning. And I think what well, I teach them in three major you could say topics. One is the housing system, to understand how housing systems work. The second is housing disadvantage, and the third is housing diversity, especially exactly what Lena was talking about before. But I want to say just that a housing system, I think it's important for me to teach students that the housing market and system is a very complex system, and it's not one person or one solution that can address it. And I think what Lena just said about, students are very worried about their future housing solutions and housing affordability, the housing crisis. All these phrases are very front of their minds. So it's important to me so they understand that the housing system and the housing market is shaped according to society's values and priorities. And it just, the fact that in Australia we only have 4% of social housing didn't come from nowhere. There's history and reasons for that, and that's a choice of policymakers, choice of investment in private market, you could say. So I don't want to make my students too depressed, but this is really important for me to explain. And then the second aspect is that, and we talked about it, maybe there's some supply issues, but I don't think it's really a lot about supply, because we know that in Australia, at least, and also it's not so much about planning stopping or standing in the way of development, because we know developers sit on permits and have land to develop on, but decide not to develop because the market is not right for them. So I really don't think it's a matter of the planning system stopping development, and this is a very important point that I try to explain to my students, because the Victorian government just recently, not recently, a year ago, released this housing statement where they're really bypassing, for large development, they're bypassing local councils and planners, and letting the planning minister, to approve these large developments, which means they actually reducing public consultation channels, which I don't think it's a good thing, and we need to be careful as planners. So that's the second thing that I'm telling my students. In terms of housing disadvantage and housing diversity, I agree with this, with these approaches of social mix that John discussed before. And I think my last point is that I try to explain to my students that when they come across social mix development, it's really important that the architectural treatment of the different communities that are mixed is similar or identical, and there's an urban design master plan that takes into consideration spaces for interaction and the management of the buildings, that there's no visible difference between different tenures or different income groups. And just the last thing that I want to say, and I promised a good example. So in Australia, there's a housing organization which is now a non-for-profit organization, which is called Nightingale Housing. I don't know if you know it, but they are doing a really good job of developing. They've done quite a few developments in Melbourne and some in Sydney, I think, or New South Wales, and in Perth as well. Developing actually communities, buildings that have private residents, but also social community housing tenants, about 20%. And with a lot of thought about sustainable design, sustainable buildings, low-cost living, and not focusing on the car as well. So really an innovative model, I think, that needs to be examined and perhaps duplicated. There's a lot to learn about that, and yes, I encourage everyone to look up nightingalehousing.org, and be inspired. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Iris. Can you maybe put that into the chat? Or it would just be good to put in the link so everybody can follow it.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Thank you. And Paula, I would like to maybe hear from you in the Global Planning Education Association network, right?
Yes, thank you.
How do we do this better? How do we do this better?
Yes, I will try to give a more broader image of my reflection. I cannot disconnect the housing problem from a huge complexity and also a systemic problem that is connected with it, with the supply. With how do we all of a sudden in a few decades we pass in the global north from housing surplus to housing scarcity without having huge increases of population. But I would like to, in a more institutional way, to address here the fact that GPAN is an associate network of 11 planning schools associations, and it's playing a huge role in cooperating with UN Habitat. And in this work with Habitat Uni, and we aim to provide recommendations and suggestions also in terms of housing policies. What we are doing now, what we are starting now in this respect on the planning profession, is a global survey that will allow to know who is teaching planning on as much as global as we can go, and how and who is doing that. Are architects, are planners per se, which types of professions of planning program or programs are addressing planning, and of course I would like here to include bring here Global South more into this debate. The fact that we have over 1 billion people living in slums and informal settlements, and we've been talking about standards for housing, but these standards are sometimes not adjusted to the standards of a global South situation. So over these years, I've been collaborating with an institution in Indonesia, the Institute of Technology of Bandung, in a global studio, which also counts with the cooperation of the University of Sydney, in which we do an immersive program with students for 2 weeks in a slum, in a kampong in Bandung. And this has been proving to be quite a unique experience for students just not to learn about housing problems, but to see them, to emerge into this context and see how what else this context can bring to their knowledge and to their education. From previous report in which Bruce contributed as a major author in 2008, published in 2009, it was clear that planning education has like two major branches, one more design oriented, other more policy oriented. And I think this is crucial when we talk about housing. We can teach students how to design good housing based on good principles, but if policies are not present there, which means the how to implement, how to go into these, how to embed these processes of justice, of ethics, of inclusivity in a more broader context, this becomes very critical. So maybe I'm biased by the fact that I'm teaching on a public policy PhD program at my university. I also have a background in design, in architecture, but clearly I've been moving my personal trajectory from design to policy, because I think this is where the main problems are. And to conclude, I think this is a matter, and the students have to be aware of that, of policy making and political will at different levels. And future planners and our institutions can and try and should try to influence that. And I will stop by here. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. I think I'm spot on, and there's some comments and questions by the audience that touch on this, right? The climate debate and what we do and the ethics, and yes, so definitely the political will and leadership is coming through in the questions. Bruce, I think I'm giving over to you now to just get our audience a bit more involved.
Yeah, we want to take a little time as best we can in this medium to capture some of the ideas from the attendees. If I can have the first Slido slide coming up. There we go. So we have a system that we want to use to gather your ideas about the biggest barriers to implementing sustainable housing. We're going to ask about barriers here, and a little while later we'll ask you about solutions. But would you please think about what you see as the biggest barrier to implementing sustainable housing solutions in your area? And then we'd like you to input one of these in just a word or two or three. I know that's hard, using this Slido system. So you can either, using your mobile phone, you can either capture the QR code, or you can use the URL that's displayed on the slide now, and then enter the number that's given, 1668361. That'll take you into the Slido system, and you'll be able to input from your phones a very short notion of what you see as the biggest barrier to implementing sustainable housing. While you do that, Yua will ask a few questions from the chat of the panelists, and they'll start to respond. And I would like to encourage panelists to be looking through the Q&A, and if there are questions that are not asked orally that you would like to answer, to go ahead and do that in writing directly in the Q&A. Yua, over to you.
Thanks, Bruce. Yes, look, I'm going through the Q&A questions, and then very interesting things. For me, the theme that's coming through that is that, you know, we can talk about housing solutions, but we also need to talk about climate action, and how do we bring this two together? I know, a big topic, but I'm keen to hear from our panelists. How do we address this? How do we think about the housing solutions and, you know, affordable housing and density done right and producing the numbers that we need, but then also doing it in a climate responsible way? Anybody that think they could offer something?
Sure, I can start. the first case study that I presented about the library parcel that was by the developer Dream, in the RFP, we put requirements for sustainability. So if they were to bid, they had to commit that they would do the Canada Green Building Zero Carbon Design certification process, and also for the operations. So in terms of that development, that was a minimum requirement, but we also evaluated their sustainability features. And so in this case, they're committing to LEED Gold for neighborhood development and new construction, as well as the One Planet framework. So I think we requested it together. It wasn't only about affordable housing, but it was also ensuring that it was sustainable development housing. So that's one way that we did it, was through our request for proposal process.
Right, that sounds really a good way forward. And maybe from other countries, do you have similar experiences, or is it a challenge? Is it still something we do not get right? No takers.
Well, just from the New Zealand perspective, again, being a smallish country with a smallish group of planners, we tend to multi-purpose. And so talking about education around climate, and as well as talking about planning, like when we were talking about land use planning, we are talking about climate action. We were talking about density and housing choice. We're also talking about the choice to have a house with a lower carbon footprint and doing one's part in that way. So yeah, compact cities, we're trying to always make those connections between, all the co-benefits that, say, density or housing choice provides, always trying to link that to climate if possible. And then adaptation is a whole different story, but again, trying to avoid making wrong decisions in the first place around location, but really working hard with central government to try to get some action on who pays for managed retreat, for example. That's a big issue coming up.
And maybe just on the theme of the multidisciplinary collaboration, right, to get housing right, how do we as planners address this? Who do we get to the table? Where's the conversation going from here? So the housing solution is we need to get more people, and there's different disciplines coming to the table. How do we as planners navigate that? John, do you want to have a go? I see your mic is not muted.
Yeah, I think planners need more and different allies. Our treasuries in our jurisdictions have a vital role to play in understanding planning, the role of planning as an instrument of the economy. Planning can lead to better return on investment, both public and private, through orderly sequencing of release and prioritization of where investment into the conversation to understand how planning works as an instrument of economic policy.
Thank you, John. I think, yes, Bruce, do you want to step in and
so maybe we just together while everyone's here and look at the results of that little Slido poll that we did on the biggest barriers to implementing sustainable housing solutions. And, I think everybody's using their own language, but there are three themes that jump out to me. And the first is the one that Jason Jordan highlighted in his introductory remarks: friction from the planning process. That the rezoning system, the regulatory barriers are key issues that we have to work on. Also, quite important in this list are what we might label under political will. NIMBYism, the reluctance of politicians to respond to the things that are necessary. And then thirdly, the disconnect between market and public policy concerns. And we have housing as an investment asset, the profit motive. So what I see here are planning process friction, political will, and market versus public policy disconnects. Thanks to everyone who put in some ideas. And let me turn things back over to you for the next questions.
Thanks, Bruce. So I would like to go from barriers back to solutions, right? So we've seen what the audience thought was some of the big barriers and challenges. So I want to put it to the panel, and mindful that we've got 19 minutes left in our official scheduled time. So very short answers, panel members. And this is hard. I know it's very hard for people to give really short answers. And this is a very hard question. But what is the one key solution or approach that you think will make the biggest impact in solving the global housing crisis? So we know there's lots, and we know it's in context. But if you have to say one thing that will make the biggest impact, what is it? Paulo, can I start with you? It's a hard one, I know.
Yes, yes, you can. I would really. I have to step back. I cannot give an answer just focused on housing. I mean, housing is connected with economy, and the moment that places in Indonesia, in Egypt, in other countries in the global south are the slums and are the suburbia of the wealthy global north, when we do not disconnect that, I think it's very difficult to have. So I'm sorry, I'm giving you a complex answer, but I prefer to try to face this complexity than just to give a simple
so it's
prescription to it.
To simplify the complexity, that's the biggest,
Yes,
perhaps the issue, right? Jim. If it's
I think adaptability is key. I mean, it's houses that last, not just from a durability perspective, but in terms of universal design, flexibility to accommodate further density, either up or sideways, relocatability, materials that can handle extreme temperatures, wet and dry, etc., can help make use not only of those materials, but the existing development footprints that reduce planning and consenting costs, preserves the productive land, open space, and biodiversity compared to greenfields. So that's more affordable long-term ultimately and more environmentally sustainable. So adaptability is my key.
Right. You, I see you were nodding, but what's your one key solution?
Well, I guess I would say I don't think this problem can be solved by the market. I feel like that's usually the solution we hear by politicians, that the market will figure it out. I really do think housing or more housing should be provided by the not-for-profit and public sectors, or to ease their ability to take on more units. And in that case, the housing stays affordable longer. It doesn't change over to an investment. And even if tenants change, the units stay affordable. So I really think that would be a current and long-term solution. I also think, this is a problem, but it'll become a solution. Our current housing supply is decreasing because we're losing the units. So we really need to focus on maintaining the current stock for affordable housing.
Thanks, you. Iris, what's your take on it? Or your one key solution?
Yeah, I agree with you, I guess. I think the major issue that I saw on the screen was political will and housing becoming an asset and not a home for many people, accumulating wealth. I think something needs to be done there. Very, very difficult, but yes, more intervention in terms of social housing and not leaving it to the hands of the market. I don't know if it can be done globally. I would argue that maybe governments can do something controlling, but we need the political will, controlling banks and changing the system.
Sure.
Thank you.
I do agree. John, do you agree, or you've got a
Yeah, no, I do have a view. Look, I was inspired by a recent article by Jago Dodson at RMIT in Melbourne. He talked about, well, if we don't have the political will to change some of the taxation settings in Australia that are driving housing to become more of an investment asset, more of a wealth creating scheme than shelter, maybe at least we can leverage those taxation settings, leverage that subsidy against some outcomes. Basically, if you're going to be getting negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts and exemptions, why not have those taxation advantages conditionally upon providing some rental advantages, some environmental performance advantages, some housing diversity advantages, and really if we can't have the political will to get rid of some of those taxation subsidies that are driving the investment asset market, at least put those subsidies to work and get an outcome.
Yep. Sounds good. Lena, what's your view?
Okay, lots of the points I was going to say are taken, but one thing that I do feel quite strongly about is that we, instead of thinking of housing as an asset, if we could kind of reframe it by thinking of it as a legacy for future generations, that would, it's kind of like thinking of that as the approach and going with something that I started with, that sort of thinking about people and planet as key factors in the way in which we make our design and planning decisions. It probably goes, and in different contexts that then obviously starts thinking about those ethical and, social issues, which are very different. But I think that somehow in the policy and language, we often think of the targets the way we isolate them. We then think of it in quantum, in numbers, provision of housing. If we kind of can think about this, in terms of that idea of dwellings, in terms of people's homes, I do feel that then there's a way in which we can capture the imagination of many more sectors. I think, maybe I'm being a bit idealistic, but I do think that idea of a legacy as opposed to an asset is something that maybe we could think about.
Yes, makes sense. And I fully agree this gets harder as we ask the next person, because all the ideas get taken up. But Lindsay, do you have a key solution?
I wish I had, but I'm building on Lena's thoughts, which is, isn't this around understanding our wider communities, understanding the value of housing that it brings as a community asset? And that's not, and I'm not just talking about financial value. In fact, I'm not talking about that at all. I'm talking about the whole social infrastructure and actually making it, we've seen on the word cloud around the need for political will, but NIMBYs. And isn't it around understanding, actually, it isn't just about an individual home, an individual house. We need those communities to look wider and understand the importance of communities, mixed communities, the benefits of green space, and how we as planners contribute to making those environments around well-being and encouraging health. So for me, it's an external view of what is the value of what we're trying to achieve.
100%. And then lastly, Jason, who started us off, what's your one key solution?
Well, I'll go very practical, and I'll say it's about capacity building. A lot of these solutions and the many great examples that were shown are, specific projects that overcame that political will problem. And I think in order for planners to do that, we need to think about systems that support planning itself, and investing in the capacity of planners to provide the local leadership that's necessary. So it's small, but I think it could have outsized impact.
Sounds really good. Bruce, maybe we should ask the audience a similar thing. See what they think.
So if I can have the second Slido slide displayed, please. There we go. And so folks, attendees, folks at quote at home, what do you believe is the most promising area to focus on for future housing solutions? So Again, your Slido input should be set to go directly into this slide, and you'll want to keep your response very brief so that it fits into the word cloud. If you would go ahead and take a moment to do that.
Let's see if the same words appear as our panel members thought. Panel members, if you want to comment on the words coming up, please feel free to do so while we see what our audience consider.
I mean, there's no capital gains tax in New Zealand, which makes housing very attractive as an investment and not so much as other things that it's supposed to be.
And I think also there's something here around being a patient investor. So acknowledging the cost of upfront infrastructure, which our communities really actually need to understand what will be provided at what stage. So it is around making that funding available, either it being grants or loans.
We'll take just another minute for folks to put in their answers.
I see the word sustainable density again appearing, and I think it would be an interesting thing to try and define. What is sustainable density? Stepping up as planners. Now that's a call for everybody on screen.
I'm also seeing a lot of community-oriented words there too. So this, no matter how important planners may be, that the community role, working with the community is certainly key, isn't it?
100%.
Student accommodation is an interesting one because I know conversations I've had, there's certain resistance from local communities, but actually the point about student accommodation is it frees up the general housing. So it's quite an interesting subject.
Yeah.
And it's a huge issue in Australia as well, because we've had a lot of students come in, just international students.
In Australia, we're finding our rental market squeezed at the top end by people unable to leave the rental market to purchase a home, and at the bottom end, people unable to leave the private rental market or not able to move into social housing because it's just simply not there in numbers. So we're getting a rental market that's squeezed at both ends, which is obviously affecting rental price.
Well, I suggest we leave the Slido poll open so folks can continue to enter their responses. But let me try to give a few of the takeaways I've drawn from the conversation over the last 2 hours. I've been impressed with how seriously many of our governments are taking the housing crisis. There's a wide variety, a wide diversity of approaches that are being taken in various countries around the world, and of course we've just scratched the surface in these last few hours. I also am impressed by the importance of, as planners, the value of our own actions. There's lots of factors that influence housing supply and demand, and we can influence many of them, but we can't control hardly any of them. And by focusing on the ones that we can control, we can make some short-term advantages and some short-term progress. And I think that's really important. They may not be the most potent interventions, but they're the most doable. I think we have to be aware of the need to address housing issues in our national contexts in ways that fit our national contexts. These are not solutions that cross borders without attention and choice. There are lots of good ideas that we can get from other places, but we can't import those good ideas without asking ourselves concretely and seriously whether they fit our national economic, political, cultural context, and adapting them to. I think we've heard a lot about the importance of political leadership, about the potential for nonprofit sector work that is outside the government system, about the importance of bringing private sector developers along in understanding public objectives. All of our stakeholder partners, if you will, as planners, are vital to finding good solutions, and we have to engage with them and partner with them in effective ways. I think we heard a lot about the importance of high density and the advantages it has for housing affordability, but also I'll comment advantages for for keeping transportation affordability in place. High density improves the potential for public transit, the potential for walkability and light individual transit, as we say these days. And then lastly, I'll just comment about how much we've heard of the importance of capacity building. When I started as a planning academic, I think we had a lot of hubris in planning schools that we were the source of the solutions that the practice world needed to learn. And I think, if anything, in the last decades, in the universities, we've come to understand that many, if not most, of the best solutions are developing in practice, and it's we in the universities who have to learn from the practice world. I think it does have to be a partnership. We need lots of connections and lots of opportunities to work together and learn from each other so that we can both find solutions that work and measure, test whether they do work, and then build them to scale so they spread around the globe effectively. I want to thank all of you on the panel for this exceptional set of reflections and ideas and your commitment to this vital concern and indeed crisis. And I want to thank all the attendees for taking the time to spend with us this morning and learn from this panel of global practitioners and educators on housing policy. Yua, do you have anything you want to add before we close?
No, just also thank you on my behalf again to RTPI for hosting and for helping us with the platform, and to all our presenters giving us your time, 2 hours out of your day. I think it's a big ask, but also for the audience listening in, and please continue this conversation. I mean, for us, it's a start, and we hope to take it forward to the World Urban Forum. And so we welcome comments and feedback and connections working on this topic. We have to get it right, and we can only get it right if we work together. So it's a good start.
And maybe it's important for me to say that this is one of a large series of events on housing matters that is organized by the World Urban Campaign this year under the umbrella label of Urban Thinkers Campuses. If you go to the World Urban Campaign website, you can find a link to many of these other events that will be taking place through the calendar year. Thank you all so much, and thanks to RTPI for hosting.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
Thanks, everybody.